There are quite a lot of myths out there about why British and American English are different, what those differences are, and which kind of English is best or better. Have Americans ruined the language, or do they alone speak the pure original version? Did the Brits deliberately change how they talked and make up new words because they were sore losers after the American Revolution? Is American English just ungrammatical slang? Which queen banned hard R's? Did rich people in England stop saying their R's and start saying bath and ask as some fake fashionable pretense to differentiate themselves from the poor? Is there a huge conspiracy where British people only talk weird when someone's listening? Let's bust some myths. Or is it myths? I quite like myths. We must preserve British English from ignorant, senseless Americanisms. 38 Americanisms the British can't bloody stand. Some people in Britain like to look down on American English. As early as 1735, a British traveller in Georgia, Francis Moore, described the town of Savannah. It is about 1.25 miles in circumference. It stands upon the flat of a hill. The bank of the river, which they in barbarous English call a bluff, is steep. In modern times, King Charles, back when he was a mere prince in 1995, complained that American English is very corrupting, and that people tend to invent all sorts of nouns and verbs and make words that shouldn't be. How exactly do you know which words should and shouldn't be? I wonder how he now feels, now that he's got grandkids that speak Californian. English doesn't actually seem to be very ruined, to me, thanks very much. It has 400 million native speakers and 1.1 billion people speak it as a second language. It's a global lingua franca and is by far the most important language for international communication. And all that despite the fact that some people call riverbanks bluffs. One of the strengths of English is its inventiveness and flexibility, much of which is thanks to American creativity. All that making up nouns and verbs that His Majesty referred to. Where would we be if we couldn't interview people, or badmouth them, or divorce each other? I personally still go on holiday rather than vacationing somewhere, but the rest of these terms are pretty normal on both sides of the Atlantic. We could also thank the USA for lots of eyes words, like prioritise, accessorise, and burglarise. Well, no, come on. Burglars burgle. We don't actually need burglarise. Just like beggars beg, liars lie, and peddlers peddle. I found out about quite a lot of these myths through comments I got on a video I did about why some British people sometimes sing in American accents. One of the ideas is that American English is some kind of fossil, that it hasn't changed since the 17th century. I mean, technically an American accent is just an 18th century British accent. There were some new local accents, but the standard English that you hear on TV news today is very close to what you would have heard in 1620. Some linguists are saying Americans use the accent Brits used about 1600, which suggests current Brit speech is corrupted. And for clarity, singers return to the accent of Queen Elizabeth I. Americans speak the King's English from the 17th century.
Well, it wasn't the King's English in the first place. The first settlers came from all over the English-speaking world, which at the time was England, half of Cornwall, bits of Scotland and bits of Wales. And they weren't posh, so they wouldn't have spoken like the King. Instead, they each brought their own dialect and their own accents, which were far more different from each other than they are today, to the extent that people would have had difficulty understanding each other. The original settlers in Tidewater, Jamestown, were from southern and southwestern England. They were Cavaliers on the losing side of the English Civil War, which in this case really wasn't about slavery. Seems to have been more about fashion. The Cavaliers were on the King's side, and they liked to wear bright colours, have their hair in ringlets, and wear floppy hats and lots of lace. Their opponents were Puritans, who wore dark colours and had short hair, earning them the nickname the Roundheads. When the Mayflower Pilgrims didn't set foot on Plymouth Rock, they would have been talking with East Anglian accents. Although since they'd been living in Leiden for 13 years, the kids probably had more Dutch accents. Indeed, one of the reasons the Pilgrims left the Dutch Republic was that they thought their children were becoming too Dutch and were being drawn away by evil examples into extravagances and dangerous causes. The Pilgrims celebrated their hard-earned religious freedom by persecuting anybody who didn't believe exactly the same as they did. They banned Catholics, hanged Quakers, or cut their ears off. The Quakers, quite understandably, wanted to live elsewhere. William Penn was given Pennsylvania in payment of a debt of £16,000 that the king owed his father. The king insisted on naming the colony after the elder Mr. Penn, much to the embarrassment of the humble young Penn. Philadelphia initially attracted working people from the North Midlands of England. The Quakers had a more neighbourly approach to loving their neighbour, which involved having good relations with the indigenous American people and mixing with the Germans, the Dutch, and even the Welsh.
Languages change naturally over time, but certain things really accelerate that change. Philadelphia was the most linguistically diverse of the original settlements, but the whole process of moving to a new continent mixed up social hierarchies whereby people from different places and different social groups mixed much more than they would have back home. This causes something called dialect levelling. The rough edges are smoothed off. Different ways of speaking and a new dialect starts to form that everyone finds easier to understand. Kids are a huge driving force behind this. They learn new accents easily and have a very strong desire to fit in. When my daughter was 3, we were living in a city in China where there were only about 40 non-Chinese people. She had only really spoken English with adults until an Australian family arrived with kids of a similar age. After just one play date with them, she came home and said, "Daddy, can I have some water?" Another factor that speeds up language change is isolation. If you look at dialect maps in many parts of the world, you'll see that natural barriers, such as rivers and mountains, create bigger differences in the way people speak. Well, the Atlantic Ocean was a pretty formidable barrier in the 17th century. As people develop a sense of belonging in their new community, their unique language becomes a source of pride to them. At the same time as these engines of change, there was a force pulling in the opposite direction. Isolated communities also start to worry that their language is becoming debased. Many people felt that it was important to keep up language standards, and many of the new communities felt that their form of English was correct as they noticed changes around them. This is shown in the huge popularity of dictionaries, spelling bees, etc. As time went on, the contact with other kinds of English and other languages increased. New arrivals both assimilated to local versions of American English and contributed new features to them. Charleston became a melting pot of people from the older colonies and from Barbados and Bermuda. Kidnapped and enslaved Africans, indentured servants, and free people from the Caribbean meant that the majority of the population of South Carolina had African origins or ancestry by 1708. By 1776, 1 in 7 Americans had Scots-Irish ancestry. That's to say people with ancestors who had previously migrated from the Scottish lowlands to Ulster, the northernmost province of Ireland, in the 17th century. So American English actually started to change very quickly almost as soon as people arrived here, and has continued to change ever since. Main factors that were driving that change have been a mixture of people arriving from different places and speaking differently, isolation, and a new sense of identity. So American English definitely isn't a fossil, which I hope is good news. I mean, who would want to speak a fossil? So what was early colonial North American English like? By 1776, people had been speaking English in North America for nearly 170 years. How did George Washington sound when he was not telling his dad that he couldn't not lie about not cutting down a tree? Or Betsy Ross when she wasn't creating the flag? Or indeed Paul Revere while not shouting the British are coming, while not riding to Concord. I'll go into more detail of that in a later video, but meanwhile, here's a reconstruction of what Benjamin Franklin probably sounded like reading from the Declaration of Independence.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Terms and conditions apply.
That they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organising its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness.
He proposed a spelling reform for English and created a phonetic alphabet for that purpose, which gives us a good idea of how he pronounced things. It doesn't sound much like modern General American or modern British English, does it? The fact that he pronounced R sounds in all positions might make people think that American English is more conservative, but it's had a much more varied history. The pronunciation of R sounds before consonants and silents had been changing for a long time. Old English bars lost its R in the 15th century, early enough for it not to turn up in the spelling. Bass, as in a fish. Old English arse, meaning buttocks, also lost its R early on, early enough to make it to North America as ass, but late enough to have kept an R in British spelling. There was sporadic R loss in the 16th century, as evidenced by spellings like morning for morning in informal writing, mainly by women. The 17th century saw many writers describe a weakening of R before consonants or silents. This increased markedly throughout the 18th century, probably starting among working class Londoners. It was only fully deemed acceptable by educated people in the 1790s. Port cities in North America remained in regular contact with England, as did wealthy people who often travelled to London and sent their sons to study in England. R dropping thus spread to Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, and later New Orleans. It also remained a feature of the educated elites, who continued to look to England for prestige and refinement for centuries. The speech of ordinary people in America was greatly influenced by Scots-Irish English, and nearly 2 million Irish people who arrived between 1840 and 1860. Irish English is still rhotic today. At the turn of the 19th century, about 6 million German speakers arrived. While Standard German and many German dialects are non-rhotic, second language learners tend to be heavily influenced by spelling. Or this is another explanation. I also heard that American English is the true English. When the Queen of England went on to ban the hard R, Americans thought it was dumb and didn't do it. I wonder which Queen banned hard R's. We hereby require everyone to stop pronouncing the letter R except after vowels. And Americans said, no, that's dumb. Except in Boston, New York, and parts of the South. Hey, Matt, the Queen says to stop saying the letter R. Pack the car in Harvard Yard. I love it. I live in a 4th floor apartment on 44th Street. We think it's mighty fine that everyone in polite society will start dropping their R's. So many Americans lost their R's and then got them back again. And the language continued to change. But were these changes as a result of laziness? And is the result somehow ungrammatical? Close, but in truth it's a lazy tongue and easier to do. When the English language was altered, it was for this exact reason. Spelling and pronunciation became easier to enable a larger population to access a simplified language. Simply, it's lazier not to bother singing properly, and trained voice regains its accent. There's a common meme that compares complex and simplified Chinese with complex English, the British kind, and simplified, the American version. While this is clearly meant as a joke between friendly rivals, I have come across learners of English who think that American English is easier to learn because it has less, or indeed no, grammar. Of course, impossible is language any, no grammar has. Grammar means the system in a language of how words are formed and how sentences are put together. Without grammar, we wouldn't be able to understand each other. There are some grammatical differences between British and American English, but basically both varieties of the language have about the same amount of grammar, if you can count it. In some cases, American grammar could be said to be the stricter of the two. In the UK, you can say the government have decided or the government has decided, depending on whether you want to focus on the individuals that make up the government or the institution as a whole. In US English, you can only say has to agree with a singular noun. US English also makes frequent use of the present subjunctive. They suggested that he apply for the job. In spoken British English, that would be they suggested that he should apply for the job. In the UK, the subjunctive form would only be used in very formal writing. Some of the differences were brought to the US by those 6 million Germans. Americans can say, "Are you coming with?" But Brits would say, "Are you coming with me or us?" In German, it's "Kommst du mit?" It's not an American accent. It's called neutral accent or lack of accent. An accent is a way of pronouncing a language that is distinctive to a country, area, social class or individual. So it's not possible not to have one. At first, I thought that people saying they didn't have an accent were just being ethnocentric, thinking that the way they pronounced things was normal and neutral and everybody else was weird. I then started seeing comments that suggest that some people actually do seem to believe that general American pronunciation is somehow more natural and fundamental than other ways of speaking. My theory is that it must take so much unnecessary effort to talk that way day in, day out, that they struggle to keep up the act when they sing. I always figured it was because singing takes more effort than talking, and it pushes the accent out of the voice. Pushes the accent out, as if it's some kind of parasite. The idea that not speaking general American requires more effort is frankly bizarre. I speak like this because everyone around me when I was learning to speak spoke like this. I've spoken like this for 60 plus years. So it comes pretty easily and doesn't require any special effort. The pure, natural, accent-free sounds that scientists call General American. So where did General American come from, and why did people start to think of it as the default way of speaking? General American is actually a relatively recent phenomenon. The term wasn't used until 1925. The accent emerged in the northeastern United States at the beginning of the 20th century. It then spread from western New England and upstate New York into the Great Lakes, often by whole church congregations moving en masse. These Yankees, and I'm using the term in its meaning of Anglo-Saxon Protestant New Englander, had long thought that they were the guardians of true English and had mocked Midwestern speech in the 1800s. These groups continued moving west, taking their accent all the way to Washington and Oregon. Another source of General American is the Atlantic seaboard. We've already seen that Pennsylvania was linguistically diverse, dating right back to its origins. This variety then mixed with Yankee English as it moved westward. In the first half of the 20th century, the prestige accent was that of upper-class families belonging to northeastern coastal elites, educated in New England boarding schools. We can hear its influence in the speech of 3 presidents from the turn of the 20th century. William McKinley was born in 1843 and was president from 1897 until his assassination in 1901. This recording is from before the assassination.
Protection to labor and industry, preservation of the home market, and reciprocity which will extend our foreign market.
You'll notice there's no R sound in his pronunciation of preservation and market.
preservation of the home market
He rolls R's between vowels, as in labour and
labour and industry,
especially foreign.
foreign
His happy vowel is long and a bit of a diphthong, reciprocity.
reciprocity.
His successor was Theodore Roosevelt, born in 1858 and president from 1901 to 1909.
The privileged classes, the representatives of special privilege, of special interest, can always make terms with a boss or bosses. They can make terms with the bosses who dominate the Republican Party. They can make terms with the bosses who dominate the Democratic Party. But they can't make terms with the people. They can't make terms with the men who honestly and genuinely represent the popular will.
He doesn't have R sounds in the word terms or popular will.
Terms, popular will.
What strikes me most about his speech is the lack of aspiration after P, T and K sounds. In most accents of English, there's a strong puff of air after these consonants in most contexts. Roosevelt has, they can't make terms with the people.
They can't make terms with the people.
While I've heard people say he sounds British, he does say representatives and party.
Representatives party,
He also seems to say interests for interests.
interest,
His happy vowel is diphthongal too. Honestly, genuinely.
honestly and genuinely.
Australian elocutionist William Tilley described and promoted this accent while teaching at Columbia University. It was taught as the standard to theatre and motion picture actors. The so-called Transatlantic accent used in Hollywood in the first half of the 20th century.
Your intolerance infuriates me. I should think that of all people, a writer would need tolerance. The fact is, you can't be a first-rate writer or a first-rate human being until you've learned to have some small regard for human
It was fake to an extent, but it is based on this East Coast boarding school accent. Roosevelt's successor was about the same age as him, having been born in 1857. He was president between 1909 and 1913. He was from Ohio, and his family wasn't wealthy, and he wasn't boarding school educated, though he did go to Yale.
I'm willing to admit that there are certain crises in the forward march of Christian civilization that perhaps could not have been met in any other way than by the sword. I'm willing to admit that war develops certain heroic traits in men and furnishes a test for the evidence of the highest character. But the other side of the picture justifies the prayer of every man, of every civilized man, that war should be abolished, and that the suffering, cruelty, corruption, and demoralization that follow in its train should be, as far as we can bring it about, lifted as a burden from the human race. They are looking to us as a country independent of entangling alliances, separated from all possible attacks by two wide oceans, rich, powerful, and in a situation where nobody can accuse us of being afraid of any nation or of taking this step because we are afraid of war if war were a necessity. It is the common people of the world that are interested in this business. It's their sisters and mothers and daughters that have to wait, trembling, to hear the news from the battlefield to learn whether their dear ones have bitten the dust. It's the great mass of the plain people that Lincoln loved so well that have to stand the brunt of war.
He has R's after vowels in some cases, forward march, but not in others. Sword, the other side, war should be abolished, dear ones, the brunt of war.
To stand the brunt of war.
He doesn't drop the yod in news, but he does drop the H in perhaps.
Perhaps.
There's also a trace of the curl-coil merger in words like soiten, feinish and boyden. It's not as strong as that.
Certain furnishes a burden.
His happy vowel is I, any nation, necessity.
Any nation, necessity.
So Taft is a kind of halfway house. much closer to General American than his predecessors, but still with some features that come from the Eastern elite, probably picked up at Yale. After not single-handedly winning World War II, the United States stopped looking to England as a definition of refined speech. Instead, radio and television adopted General American as a heartland variety. Increased suburbanization meant that richer and more educated Americans started mixing only with each other. And as we've seen before, isolation can drive language change. Suburbanites strove to conform, cookie-cutter accents to match their cookie-cutter houses. Status-conscious social climbers wanted to avoid the negative stereotypes associated with regional accents, such as poverty or supposed low intelligence in the South. Racially, people wanted their accents to reflect the prestige of wealthy white Anglo-Saxons, avoiding traits reminiscent of African Americans or Eastern Seaboard Jewish communities. So if General American is a non-accent, does that mean everybody had an accent 100 years ago? And if you think you don't have an accent, how do people know where you're from when you go abroad? Unless you wear plaid trousers. So we've seen how American English has changed over time, but what about in Britain? And were the changes there deliberate? As it was basically entombed after the Revolutionary War and earlier. The US kept the British accent and the dialect words at the time, while the Brits went home and changed how they talked and what words meant what. Especially gas, petrol, etc.
So, we're going home. I'm pretty disappointed that we lost to a gaggle of farmers.
Yeah, me too. The Great British Army beaten by amateurs.
If only there was some way we could get our revenge.
Yeah, how can we get our sense of superiority back?
Hey, I've got an idea. We could make up a whole new way of talking, and then look down on the Americans for not talking like us.
I love it. We could start by choosing a random letter and not pronouncing it anymore. How about S?
That's hard. We'd meh, hey? And we wouldn't be able to A plural anymore. One dog, two dog. I get R in Ted.
So R becomes ah. That's brilliant. Avenge is ours. All Britannia. Unabbit, unabbit, un. It really rolls off the tongue. Creates a kind of oagish romanticism right off the bat.
Yeah, on second thoughts, maybe we shouldn't overdo it. Let's keep the R, only if there's a vowel after it.
Roger to that. And we could have really pretentious vowels like bath and pass instead of bath and pass. But not everywhere. So people would have to learn that it's ask, but asp.
Huh?
Egyptian snake.
Oh yeah. And we could change the words for stuff, like petrol instead of gas, boot instead of trunk, bonnet for hood, all the car words.
What's a car? In 1781, there's no such thing as a car.
You're right. Anyway, we'd better head to the airport. Now that Cornwallis has surrendered, we're out of here. And we have to think about how we're going to convince 12 million people to start talking weirdly just to spite the Americans. I'm not sure most people actually care that we've lost the colonies.
Carl Benz invented the motor car or automobile in 1886. As often happens with new inventions, different words became popular in different parts of the world. For example, GPS in the US is called sat-nav in the UK. Gasoline is actually an interesting case. Petrol cars didn't really gain prominence over steam and electric models until around 1910. The fuel they ran on was originally called motor spirit, a term still used in Nigeria. Mr. John Cassell called his brand of motor spirit Gasoline. After a trademark dispute with an Irish shopkeeper, he changed the C to a G. The name became generic in the US and Canada, where the spelling changed to gasoline. That's actually quite a common process where brand names become the generic name of a thing. Think Xerox, Band-Aid and Jell-O in the US for photocopier, sticking plaster and jelly. Hoover and Tannoy for vacuum cleaner and PA system in the UK. Bayer trademarked the word heroin in 1898, but it's become generic, and they lost the trademark in most countries in 1919. I think there are three problems with the idea that the language was deliberately changed after American independence. I don't really think most people were that bothered, especially ordinary people. The war was expensive, which increased the national debt. Trade was interrupted briefly, but by 1785, trade with the US had returned to the same level as trade with the colonies before the war, and trade with Europe doubled. For those who did like having colonies, they still had Canada, great swathes of Africa and India. They were about to colonise Australia, and the British Empire was about to grow to be the largest the world had ever known. I think that must have kind of made up for losing the 13 colonies. Even if they were a bit miffed after the Boston Tea Party and all that, changing the language would be a bit of a weird reaction. When all those other people won back their countries from the largest empire the world has ever known, I don't think anyone suggested changing the language again. Also, how would you even go about artificially changing a language? You'd have to make up a new way of speaking and then somehow convince millions of people to adopt it. Some people seem to think that's what happened with RP, or received pronunciation. We'll look at that myth a bit later. First though, let's bust the myth that American English is laid back and informal, and the UK variety is stuffy and pompous. American English is so informal. People say that American English is too informal. What would be simplistic and informal here is formal for them. And what is standard boilerplate corporate here is insane archaic formal for Americans. I was once looking at a film script with a group of French people, and they were shocked to find the form goner in a British film. Mais ça c'est de l'américain, they exclaimed shruggily. That's American. The idea that British people are all formal and polite clearly comes from people who've never seen a town centre on a Saturday night, and have watched too much Downton Abbey instead. I'm actually quite surprised by how formal American English is. People call strangers sir and ma'am all the time, even if they're not their superior officers, customers in posh establishments, or members of the royal family. Legal documents in the US are written in such archaic language, I'm surprised they don't use quills. You all changed your accents as part of fads in the Isles as well as in the colonies. The modern English received accent is an affectation that came along in the 1800s. British accent was invented 200 years ago. Are you not aware that the 10 or so different accents across England that the rest of the world simply identifies as British is relatively modern, and for lack of a better word, artificially and intentionally created and eventually adopted as some sort of nationalistic pride effort? As I understand, 2 centuries ago, most of the working class would have sounded like modern-day Americans. Wow, so there are only 10 accents in the UK. And not just RP is fake, but they all are. And in 1824, most working class people in England sounded American. Yeah, no. People have been speaking English in England for about 1,000 years. So there are countless accents and they develop naturally. It isn't surprising at all. All the regional non-rhotic accents of Britain were artificially introduced post-colonial era, when the royals and snooty nobles pushing that RP stuff hard, and it diverging from there. Royals and snooty nobles as RP pushers. Do they hang out outside the school gates? Hello, children. Would you like to try some new vowels? How about dropping your R's? This does seem to be quite a pervasive idea, though. RP, or received pronunciation, is what many people think of as the British accent. Unlike all the different regional accents of England, RP isn't marked as being from a particular place. Instead, it's a social accent used by educated middle and upper class people. It isn't, and has never been artificial though. It's clearly very closely related to the local accents of university cities like London, Oxford and Cambridge, and the top posh boarding schools such as Eton and Harrow. All the features that differentiate it from US varieties are also common in those accents. R dropping, long R in words like bath and pass, etc. We looked earlier at what happened when small groups of people with different accents came together in the colonies. were isolated from the rest of society and formed new identities. Well, the same thing happened with boarding schools and prestigious universities. Over the years, a ruling class accent developed which spread around the country and began to be considered as the standard. Phonetician Daniel Jones coined the term received pronunciation in 1926. Previously, he'd called it public school pronunciation. Certain kinds of private schools are called public schools in England and Wales. The word received probably adds to the confusion, and hence the myth. Jones is using it in the sense of generally accepted, like received wisdom. So generally agreed on, but not actually established or imposed on anyone. RP was then a natural choice for use in radio and television later, since most potential broadcasters would have been public school boys in any case. The rich didn't need a specially made-up accent to differentiate themselves from the poor. They had mansions and palaces for that. In any case, the rich don't care. They speak however they want. Just listen to any older member of the royal family. They all speak using the least effort possible to move their mouths. It's the middle classes who make every effort to sound posh, often adopting spelling pronunciations such as often, and hyper-correct grammar such as between you and I. There's a wonderful scene in The Crown between Princess Margaret and Margaret Thatcher, where Thatcher says, "I beg your pardon," and the princess corrects her.
Oh, I beg your pardon. God, don't say that either. Say what?
Now, it may be true that the nouveau riche paid elocution teachers to improve their accents, but they were learning to speak how the upper classes already spoke, not some new fake accent. Stop hiding the truth from us. Y'all don't have an accent when nobody's around. It's because those British-sounding accents are just people pretending. So how do British people really speak to each other when no one else is around? Is there a massive conspiracy that's been going on for 250 years? I wonder.
We hope you've enjoyed your visit to the United Kingdom, Mr. President.
Yes, indeed. Have a very safe journey.
Thank you, Your Majesties. Next time you come to the United States, I'll take you on a tour of my hometown, Scranton.
Oh, that would be simply lovely.
Yes, Scranton. I don't believe one has ever been there. I gather it's enchanting. Well, thanks again and bye for now.
Oh, Charles, I'm totally exhausted. It's so tough having to speak in these dumb fake accents all the time.
I know, honey. Sometimes I wish we could just stop pretending and use our normal voices.
But why can't we? You're king now, and you could just order everyone to stop pretending. I'm so scared Harry's going to let the cat out of the bag any day now.
Yeah, but if we admit we've been lying to the world for hundreds of years about how British people really talk, they'll start to believe all those other conspiracy theories, like how Australia is fake and the royal family are lizard aliens.
Oh, but Charles, no one really buys into that nonsense.
Sometimes I wish we could just stop pretending and use our normal...